Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Now, last week we talked about a number of issues we felt Intel customers would like to see them address, and in the face of growing competition from AMD, they should certainly consider a few of them. Issues such as platform compatibility, the underwhelming box cooler, and then the massive separation between the base and boost clocks, which sees the TDP rating now abused. And of course, there were many more. At the end of that video, I noted that we would be targeting AMD next and talk about areas where the red team can do better. And well, this is that video. As the current underdog, AMD has more reason to play nice. They've been forced into doing many of the things that we've been asking Intel to do simply because of their much smaller market share. So as I said in the Intel version of this video, we don't believe AMD is a saint, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's still a big company trying to achieve all the things that big companies set out to achieve. Basically make as much money as possible. If you did miss part 1, which focused on Intel, I recommend you go and watch that video first. I'll provide a link in the video description or as a pinned comment. But to quickly summarize the series, a few weeks ago, Tim and myself were over in Taiwan attending the Computex trade show. And we found ourselves discussing quite a few areas where Intel, AMD, and Nvidia need to improve to become more consumer friendly. And at the end of that discussion, we thought it would actually make for a pretty good video series. Since we've already tackled the big one, Intel, it's time to talk about AMD, and while there really isn't that much to discuss on the CPU front, we also have a few GPU related things that we can talk about. I'll talk about each point that was raised, and please note that none of this is in any particular order. Some things will be more important than others. Again, we're just looking at this from the perspective of a consumer, so let's get into it. In our What Intel Needs to Fix video, we mentioned that Intel uses a pretty useless TDP metric that people often confuse for power consumption. The TDP rating only refers to the heat dissipation required to run the CPU at its base clocks, which makes little sense in the world where CPUs frequently run well above the base clock for maximum performance. Well, AMD aren't going to be left the hook either. Their TDP rating also makes little sense and only serves to confuse buyers and enthusiasts, at least in our opinion. How AMD calculates the TDP is different to Intel, but like with Intel's TDP, it only vaguely relates to power consumption and isn't really a good reflection of how much power a modern processor uses during actual operation. And because it isn't a good reflection of power consumption, it's really not a good metric for deciding how beefy your cooler needs to be. AMD's exact definition of the TDP is the maximum power a processor can draw for a thermally significant period while running commercially useful software. That's just a meaningless statement that allows AMD to effectively choose whatever TDP they like. The end result is a Ryzen 7 2700 and Ryzen 3 1300X that have the same TDP, even though one is an 8-core CPU clocked up to 4.1 GHz and the other is a quad-core clocked at 3.7 GHz. Doesn't make any logical sense that both CPUs would have the exact same TDP, and looking at the actual power consumption figures for each processor, it's quite clear that the 2700 does consume a lot more power. It's true that AMD's TDP does seem to fall closer to real-world power consumption, but it's still such a useless metric for everyday PC builders. AMD should provide an actual power consumption metric that allows everyone to easily compare processors, particularly for higher-end CPUs. It'd make it so much easier to know how much power is dissipated when running the CPU's highest possible performance level, so that way you can go and buy a cooler that meets that spec. Okay, so this one was a bit cheeky. Funny at first, but now it's just becoming a bit childish, confusing, and I suppose even frustrating for potential buyers. Again, AMD are the underdogs. They were coming into this fight at an extreme disadvantage with Ryzen, so we can kind of understand why they decided to copy Intel's naming schemes. Personally, I would have preferred AMD to be smart about the naming and call the quad-core Ryzen parts Ryzen 4, for example, and then the 8-core parts Ryzen 8. Then give the SMT-enabled models the X suffix, for example. Instead, though, they copied the Core i3, i5, and i7 naming with the Ryzen 3, 5, and 7, but we don't really have too much of an issue with that. The big problem has been the chipset naming. The X370 and X470 chipsets are okay. They're different enough from Intel's Z series, such as the Z370, for example. Still a little confusing, but it's not too bad. The B350 and now B450 chipset names are, they're quite unfortunate. The B series from Intel was meant to be their business range, though it's now somehow just become a gaming thing. And with the 100 and 200 series, we did have the B150 and B250 chipsets. AMD beat Intel to the punch with B350, so Intel decided to one-up them and release a B360 chipset. So now we have B150, 250, and 360 from Intel, with B350 from AMD. There was a strong rumor that AMD would be releasing a Z490 chipset around the same time Intel was expected to release the Z390 chipset, but thankfully it seems those plans have been cancelled. Still, the popular B series is extremely confusing, especially for those that don't live and breathe PC tech. I have heard from a few people who build a new PC every 2 to 3 years that have purchased a B360 board thinking that it would work with their Ryzen CPU, or vice versa, bought a B350 board thinking it would work with a Coffee Lake CPU. Some of you might say, well, that's a stupid mistake to make. But again, if you're only building a PC every few years and you hear that a B350 board is the best value for your Ryzen CPU, it's conceivable that you might accidentally order a B360 board. Anyway, trolling Intel was a bit of fun, quite amusing, but I think it's time to get serious now. So as a consumer, we want chipset names to be a lot less confusing. Maybe AMD could go with something like R450 and R470 as an example. That would be much clearer. Okay, so if you missed it, but given the views you probably didn't, back in early May I created a video titled Why AMD's superior compatibility could end, and it's all your fault. Basically, I talked about how AMD was copping a lot of flack from inexperienced system builders who ran into troubles with outdated B350 or X370 boards, and by outdated I mean they were using an older BIOS that didn't support the new 2nd gen Ryzen CPUs. In summary, I concluded by saying that this wasn't AMD's fault. Those complaining simply need to accept the fact that they were taking on the role as the PCEG technician. It was really up to them to make sure that the motherboard had the appropriate BIOS. However, I did state that while not AMD's fault, after all, they did ensure continued compatibility while Intel continues to axe it after a year or two at the most, there are things AMD could do to help. Things more practical and financially viable than their bootkit band-aid. What we as consumers would like to see is AMD working with their board partners, so MSI, ASRock, Gigabyte, and ASUS for example, and work with those guys to implement a Ryzen BIOS flashback feature. A feature that would allow a motherboard's BIOS to be updated without needing the correct CPU to boot it up. In fact, you wouldn't need a CPU at all. Although this one is more on the board partners, AMD could certainly get involved to make sure this is a feature that's implemented on all AM4 and TR4 motherboards. The good news is it seems that board makers are starting to wise up. For example, we saw at Computex that all future MSI AMD boards will support a BIOS flashback feature, even the very cheapest boards. Hopefully AMD will nudge all their board partners into making this a standard Ryzen feature. Something AMD needs to improve rather than fix is the Integrated Memory Controller, or IMC for short. Some decent steps were made with 2nd gen Ryzen, but there's still a bit of work to be done, and we're sure AMD is well aware of that. Memory frequency is still quite limited, and we've also found that you still do require a good chip to hit 3400 and beyond. Things do get even worse if you plan to fully populate your motherboard's DIMM slots. 4 memory modules will likely force you down to a lower speed than that of 2 modules. Memory compatibility is still somewhat limited as well, though we realise that the Ryzen processors have only been on the market for about a year and a half now, and support for the platform is improving all the time. Still, we would like to see AMD continue to improve DDR4 memory compatibility in the short term. Long term, they will transition to DDR5, and then we'll start this all over again, though AMD will be starting from a much better position. Like the IMC of the Ryzen CPUs that we just spoke of, we're sure AMD's working hard to improve the competitiveness of the Radeon GPUs. That being the case, we won't bang on about this one too much. It's my opinion that the current Radeon architecture, in this case the Graphics Core Next or GCN 5th generation architecture, needs to be better optimized. Right now, in order to deliver equivalent performance at the high end, AMD's GPUs are over 50% larger when compared to Nvidia's Pascal architecture. I arrived at that figure when comparing Vega 64 to the GTX 1080, for example. This not only makes AMD's Vega GPUs much more costly to produce, but they also require much more power to operate. It seems that AMD's allocated a huge amount of resources in an effort to try and fix their scheduling issues that see so many of the cores on parts like Vega 64 underutilized or not utilized at all during heavy gaming workloads. Another issue that's led to Vega's underwhelming gaming experience, and this is probably the main issue, is the fact that AMD produce one mammoth GPU to do it all, whereas the competition has two separate product lines, one focused solely on gaming, with a more expensive professional line designed for compute work. They probably need to work towards a design that can be easily implemented to suit either market, much like what they've done with Zen with the Ryzen and EPYC CPUs, for example. We were hoping that Navi would be the first step towards that, but it's sounding like we might have to wait another generation yet. At the end of the day, as consumers, we just want to have more than one option, and while picking between, say, the Radeon RX 580 and GeForce GTX 1060 can be a challenge, as we saw in a recent comparison, it's less of a challenge at the high end, and anyone spending, I don't know, $400 or more on a graphics card should probably go with the green team. This one isn't something that's going to go away anytime soon, despite the fact that we would all very much like it to. Rather than refresh, rebrand, or rehash, whatever you want to call it, just don't do that. Do nothing, wait until you actually have something new. Of course, it's not just AMD that's guilty of doing this. Nvidia loves to rebrand, or whatever you want to call it, products as well. Though it has to be said, recently AMD has been the biggest offender. Nvidia did release the GeForce 10 series in mid-2016, and then a few months later we got the underwhelming Radeon RX 400 series. The flagship part was the RX 480, and it did struggle to compete with the GTX 1060 at the time. Anyway, just 8 months later, in an effort to spice up the Radeon series and make them seem new and exciting again, AMD rebranded the RX 400 series as the RX 500 series, and the only truly new bit of silicon we got was the pathetic little RX 550, while the RX 560 was fully unlocked with 1024 cores, though AMD did manage to cock that one up, creating the 14 CU and 16 CU mess. Anyway, the refresh was designed to set the stage for the Vega series, which arrived 4 months later. So while Vega 56 and 64 were new parts, the RX 580, RX 570, well, those were just blatant rebadges. The RX 560 was a refresh that kind of went wrong in the end, and the RX 550 was the only truly new GPU below the Vega models. It's my opinion that ideally AMD should have just added the Vega 56 and 64 GPUs alongside the RX 400 series, and that would have been a lot less confusing and led to far fewer disappointing reviews of rebranded products. As I said, Nvidia is every bit as guilty when it comes to rebranding or refreshing GPUs, so it's a practice that we would like to see both companies just completely forget about. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about FreeSync before wrapping all of this up. In general, FreeSync is a great initiative and it brings adaptive sync support to a wide range of monitors at an affordable price point. It's certainly nice to see FreeSync monitors available at much lower prices than equivalent G-Sync monitors, but there are a few issues with the FreeSync monitor ecosystem, and it would be nice to see AMD tidy it up. For starters, FreeSync badges are a bit of a mess. You can find really good FreeSync monitors on the market, and you can find really bad FreeSync monitors. Having the FreeSync badge says nothing about the quality of the display, just that it supports the VESA Adaptive Sync standard. Crucially, it doesn't tell you how well a monitor supports adaptive sync. There are many FreeSync certified monitors with a very small refresh rate window, so small they don't actually enhance the gaming experience at all. While technically these sorts of monitors are FreeSync compliant, they may as well not have FreeSync at all. What we think AMD really needs is something like a FreeSync Gold badge maybe, or something along those lines anyway, that lets gamers distinguish between basic FreeSync implementations and FreeSync monitors with good quality panels and low frame rate compensation that delivers a good gaming experience. AMD did try this with FreeSync 2, but that's more designed for top-end HDR displays. A FreeSync Gold badge would be perfect for regular displays that deliver great experiences, from basic 1080p 144Hz models right up to top-end ultra-wides. One of the good things about Nvidia's G-Sync validation is that it ensures you get a good gaming monitor when you see the G-Sync badge. If AMD did something similar, it would not only strengthen the FreeSync ecosystem, but it would make it easier to pick out a good gaming monitor. So there's about half a dozen things we as consumers feel AMD needs to address. Admittedly, many of these things AMD is no doubt already working on, but things like the meaningless TDP rating probably won't get addressed, unfortunately. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, hang tight because next week we will tackle what NVIDIA needs to fix, and that could be a much longer list. So let us know in the comment section down below if there's anything you think we missed for this video, and if you have any suggestions for the upcoming NVIDIA version. As always, thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I will see you again next time.